Welcome to another conversation with Carl. Remember to follow, like, and subscribe for access to the latest content. Today, we're going to talk about gun safety in the wake of the horrendous tragedy that occurred back in December at Bondi Beach in Australia. 15 people, including a 12-year-old, were murdered. Today, we speak to Stephen Bendle. He is the Senior Advocacy Advisor at the Alannah and Madeleine Foundation. It is an Australian not-for-profit dedicated to keeping children free from violence. Stephen is also the Governor of the Australian Gun Safety Alliance. Welcome, Stephen Bendle, to the conversation.
Good morning or evening, Carl.
Thank you for joining me today. Go back in time. Where was firearm safety in Australia back in the 90s?
Yeah, well, Australia, of course, is a federation of 8 states and territories with a Commonwealth government, and the states and territories are responsible for gun laws. So we have some differences, of course, between all of those states and territories. The federal government's responsible for the importation of firearms. And between 1975 and 1995, there had been 13 mass shootings in Australia of greater than 5 people. Tragically, 104 victims have been killed and many more injured. There had been multiple efforts to harmonise and strengthen the gun laws in Australia. Every year, our police ministers would get together with an agenda item that established gun reform, and the states just couldn't agree on what that should be. And in fact, at a gun summit in 1987, the largest state is New South Wales. Its premier came out and complained to the media that it would take a massacre in Tasmania before anything would happen in Australia. And unfortunately, that was a prophecy that came true.
So talk about what happened in 1995, where you guys changed your gun laws.
Yeah, it was 1996. Port Arthur is a tourist destination in Tasmania. It's a penal settlement that was a popular picnic and tourist destination just out of Hobart, in the capital of Tasmania. And on Sunday, 28th of April in 1996, a lone perpetrator drove to the area with multiple automatic and semi-automatic firearms, and it killed 35 people. He took siege to a cafe there overnight and was eventually captured the following morning, on the Monday morning. The 35 people included a 6-year-old and 3-year-old, which was Alannah and Madeleine, and their mother, Nanette, and their father, Walter McCack, formed the Alannah and Madeleine Foundation the following year. And as you said in the introduction, has been fighting against all types of violence for young people. And gun violence is one of those issues that we continue to address even today.
So what was shocking about Bondi Beach, from someone who lives in the States, is that we were always told that Australia has the strongest gun laws. So what happens after 95, 96? You guys have very strong gun laws. When anyone's talking about gun safety in the US, we always point to Australia.
Yeah, well, we are rightfully proud of our gun laws that were reformed after 1996. But of course, as you've said, Bondi has really awakened the consciousness of the public about the issues of firearms. But in the immediate aftermath of the Port Arthur tragedy, our newly instated Prime Minister, John Howard, led a bipartisan approach to strengthen our gun laws. And within 12 days of Port Arthur, all of our states and territories had come together and agreed on 2 primary initiatives. One was a national firearms agreement that established a minimum set of requirements for the use and possession of a firearm. It also established quite clearly that the use and possession of a firearm was a privilege. It was not a right, and that privilege was entirely conditional upon public safety. So the National Firearms Agreement addressed all issues of firearm management, from licensing, storage, transfer, sale, categorization of firearms, transportation of firearms. So a wide range of issues that were addressed as a minimum set of standards. There was also a public funded buyback of what were now prohibited firearms, because all automatic and semi-automatic firearms, or, as they're referred to often in America as assault rifles, they were banned, prohibited from general use. There are some small carve-outs for that, for professional and contract wildlife management and pest control, but that's a very handful of people that have access to those firearms. So now that those firearms were prohibited, and there was a gun buyback that purchased those back from otherwise licensed owners, and also there were thousands and thousands of people who just decided they didn't need their firearms stored in their house anymore, and they handed those in as well. There were over 700,000 prohibited firearms that were bought back in the 12 months after Port Arthur.
What happens in Bondi Beach? Because this person had a license, from what I understand.
Yeah, well, in the interim period, deaths from firearms have more than halved. That's both in homicide and self-harm. Today, about 85% of all gun deaths in Australia is self-harm. So it is very rare that they are used for homicide. It's even rarer that they're used for multiple deaths. There was a research study done in 2019 in Australia that used an insurance model of unlikely events. And it identified the intervention of the 1996 gun laws could have been expected to have prevented 16 mass shootings between 1996 and 2018. And that's based on, as I said, an insurance actuarial approach to the likelihood of unlikely events. So those reforms did a significant job in reducing both the mortality from firearm deaths, but also eliminated, until 3 weeks ago, the idea of mass shootings. So on one hand, those reforms have worked remarkably well. However, there were certainly these perpetrators 3 weeks ago who had a wherewithal they had both a motivation, which was a ideological motivation to cause harm. And of course, they had the wherewithal with being licensed firearm owners.
So how did they get their license? I think the question that I'm keep coming back to, where did they get their license from?
So in Australia, there are quite detailed steps in order to get a license. And my understanding, and this is all still to be investigated, but one of the perpetrators got their license about 6 or 7 years ago. The exact details are still being discussed. But to apply for a license, you have to, first of all, demonstrate to the police in your state that you have a genuine reason for a firearm license. And those genuine reasons are identified in that National Firearms Agreement that I mentioned earlier. There's a range of them that include hunting, sporting, shooting, security. There's a number of reasons. Interestingly, in Australia, Carl, self-defense is not a genuine reason for a firearm. Nevertheless, this person demonstrated to the police that they had a genuine reason. Now, the exact details of that haven't been disclosed yet. I'm sure it will when we have our coroner's investigation. But once that person's proven to the police that they have a genuine reason for a firearm license, they then have to complete a what we call a fit and proper person test. So that's a detailed insight and background check, not only a background check of from a criminal point of view, but also their physical and increasingly mental health check as well. We have some jurisdictions in Australia that require a mental health check from a registered mental health professional who has to disclose whether they might be at any risk to themselves or to the public. And it might take a number of months for the police to go through that background check and determine that someone is a fit and proper person in order to have a firearm license. Then they have to demonstrate a genuine reason to have a firearm. And once again, there are processes to go there. But by all accounts, one of these perpetrators at Bondi, and I think it's public, you might know, it's a father and son. I understand the father demonstrated all of that capability to the police and had a firearm license given. And he was then able to purchase firearms and had apparently 6 firearms they were able to use. It's a process someone needs to go through.
What do you want to see happen in Australia now?
Well, there's quite a range of issues that we've taken up with government now. Australians, as we said earlier, have been very proud of our gun laws. But what's happened is that we've also been blissfully unaware of the growth in the number of firearms in Australia, the types of firearms available, and also the number of firearms that a single person is able to own. So the types of firearms that were used at Bondi appear to be rapid action, high velocity with magazine capacity that was really unforeseen when our National Firearms Agreement was established 30 years ago. So we don't think our laws have kept up with those issues. Also in Australia, we only have one jurisdiction who only last year introduced the cap on the number of firearms that Australians can own. So in Australia, in most jurisdictions, there is no limit to the number of firearms you can own. And so we have a situation where those perpetrators had 6 firearms at their availability. So we think there should be a cap on the number of firearms used. Someone needs to be able to demonstrate why they need multiple firearms. And in some cases, farmers and primary producers and some sporting shooters, there's a genuine need for that. But we're not sure why someone like this perpetrator needed 6 rapid fire firearms stored in suburban streets in Sydney.
Well, that's what I
just
never.
one aspect.
That's what I don't understand is why do people need so many guns? But I figure there was a lot of hatred behind this. It was very anti-Semitic. He had planned this attack against Jewish people on Hanukkah. And I'm just not sure why he needed so many guns.
No, and I think, there are millions of Australians right now thinking exactly the same thing. Many, we've been the Australian community has been relatively complacent about our firearm laws, given that, we hear about multiple shootings in America every day. It doesn't happen here. And so we've been pretty comfortable with our situation. But this was a horrific tragedy that has awakened so many issues. How did it happen? How did he have firearms? How did he have so many firearms? Genuine questions.
Going forward, how do you want to see Australia handle this?
Well, I think our government seems to be addressing the 2 fundamental issues. One is the issue of anti-Semitism, and that is not my area of expertise. It is an area that the government is addressing in a number of different ways, and I think they need to certainly up their efforts on that. So I'll leave that aside. They're also addressing the issues of firearm reforms and addressing the issues that I talked to you about this morning, Carl, in that there are many technological changes over the last 30 years. There are different ownership patterns of firearms. There are the influence of the firearm industry in manufacturing, developing and marketing new and different firearms for a commercial purpose is also one that needs to be addressed, right through to things such as banning political donations from the firearm industry. And we do that here for many other industries such as tobacco. But there is a commercial interest, much as there is in your country, Carl, that pushes the issues of firearm marketing. And we think we need to disrupt that as well.
As someone who is spending a lot of time in this trying to prevent tragedies like this, why do you think people want guns? That's a question I try to think of a lot of, and I try to understand it. And I'm always trying to go back to why.
Yeah, you might not be talking to the right person to
Okay.
answer the
Okay.
question. There is a sporting and target stream. Shooting is an Olympic sport. So there is a pathway where people take that up as a hobby. Australia, as you know, is basically a rural country with most of our population living in cities. So the issue of pest control, vermin is significant, and there are many people who live in suburban Australia, but who would go out on a weekend to their mate's farm. There is a recreational aspect, to that. And once again, we think that the pest control is a government issue. I don't think it should be outsourced to a recreation industry that is marketed to by the shooting industry. So there's lots of different reasons to have a firearm, and we think that that's just rolled along in Australia in the absence of, effectively a burning bridge of mass shootings. We think it needs to be disrupted now so that we never want to get to a situation, unfortunately, with the number of firearm deaths that there are. So, for example, in your country, in Australia, firearm deaths occur in about 1 in 100,000 people in Australia, and in America, it's about 15 per 100,000 people. So, there's a significant difference, and we need to interrupt that, growth and, use of firearms.
How do you think America changes course?
Yeah.
Or
Well,
you don't know? Or I'm throwing the question out there because
yeah,
I think as someone who's so passionate about gun control,
yeah,
I question how do we translate that into the US and how do we prevent that from happening here?
yeah. Well, I think, the firearm industry and firearm use in America has been hijacked by a commercial interest and who create fear. They create a marketing imperative for people to own and use firearms. They've hijacked the Second Amendment to transform it into a reason to have firearms. Australia was a penal colony established of convicts. We've never had an armed militia here, and we're done quite well. So there's some way of being able to disrupt that process. One of the interesting trends I see, Carl, in the last 12 months or so, it's my understanding that a lot of gun safety advocates have been running for local, state and federal elections. And I think that if you can get a greater representation of gun safety advocates in your legislature, in those public roles that influence policy, that might get around to disrupting this process. But it's a generational thing in America, the number of firearms that are there, but the passion for firearms is something that needs to be disrupted over many years. But it's a policy base that needs to be disrupted, and hopefully that strategy is one that can get people in the right places to be making better decisions.
How do you think, as you are going forward in Australia, would it be to change the gun laws right now?
In Australia,
Yes, in Australia.
tragically have a burning bridge where the public consciousness around firearms has been elevated, tragically. And there was a recent poll done in the shadow of Bondi that said 92% of people said no restrictions would be too far in changing our gun laws. There is a strong community interest, but also expectation. And that is across the political divide, that is across gender, across the demographics of metropolitan and rural communities. And governments understand that. Governments know that this is a time where reform is expected from the community. I don't think it's one of those things that, and I've been criticised and my colleagues have been criticised for, riding on the back of tragedy to make reform. But we're only voicing what the community expects. The community has been outraged by what's happened, both in the issues around anti-Semitic terrorism, but also about the access to firearms in our suburban streets. And they expect some change. And we think Right now, Carl, there are processes in place. Our Prime Minister announced yesterday that Parliament in Canberra is being recalled next week to consider new legislation around anti-Semitism and firearm reform. So it's in process, and as I said, that's what the community expects.
You mentioned the number 92%. Why do you think it's so high in Australia that are looking for reform?
That percentage equates roughly to the number of people who have no interaction with firearms. Only about 5 to 6 across our different jurisdictions, only about 5 to 6% of Australia, predominantly males, have firearm licenses and firearms. So we have a situation where about 5% of the population is influencing firearm policy in this country. 95% of the population might know somebody with a gun. A huge number of that percentage has never even seen a gun. So it doesn't surprise me when we have that level of support, because firearms in our community are relatively rare, yet about half of firearms are stored in suburban streets. As I said before, because of our geography, that's how where people store their firearms. But I'm sure in my street here, there are many firearms, just not sure who owns them.
It's high in America too. There's a lot of people that want sensible gun control, and they're looking for that, and we don't get that. So I think that we're also in America having that same struggle, but our people who are making these changes and our lawmakers are not there yet, where I think where the people are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I've been watching with great interest over the last 5 or 6 years about the young people out of, for example, Parklands and other
Yeah.
shootings, and their influence in the gun control movement. And I've had great interest and great hope in their effect over time as well. And as I said before, I think it's a generational thing. If the younger audience can start to mobilize on the issue, and if there are more people in more positions of decision making and policy setting, hopefully they're where some of the changes can happen.
Do you work with a lot of young people in your trying to change gun control laws?
Interestingly, in Australia, most of our advocacy work is direct to government. As I said before, there isn't a strong community movement on the issue of firearms because there hasn't had to be. I've probably in the last 3 weeks had more phone calls and emails and messages from random people in the community wanting to be involved than I have in the last 5 years. Because most people, as we've said, have been relatively complacent. But that's a good thing because we haven't had to, face this issue head on. Since Bondi, we've had a great deal of community interest and community engagement, and we think that probably continue to accelerate as these reforms come through over the next little while.
As we wrap up here, your final thoughts on where we are, where we're going, how we get there?
I think that Australia has shown, and while we've had this tragedy before Christmas, Australians have shown that gun reform works. The impact of firearms on mortality and morbidity has reduced significantly, and yet we don't have put anything in place that prevents somebody pursuing their genuine reason to use a firearm. So if someone can genuinely demonstrate that they are a sporting shooter, a target shooter, a hunter, they can pursue their recreation or their hobby. And we don't want to interrupt that, but we do think that there should be more controls over that. And I think that if, the country has an opportunity of reframing the argument around not necessarily the abolition of firearms, but a greater restriction and control over the types, the numbers, and the access to firearms, there is merit in that approach. And as I said, I think in the US, hopeful of a younger generation of influencing change and being able to be put in positions of power that, impact policy and disrupt the influence of the commercial interest.
Stephen Bendle, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for listening as well. If you have questions, put them in the comments, or if you have any comments, put them down there. Thank you so much. And until next time, be safe.